I was reviewing quarterly projections with my team when my phone buzzed. Human Resources. The call wasn't scheduled, but I answered anyway, stepping into the hallway for privacy. Mrs. Donovan, the CEO has approved your termination effective immediately, the voice said, flat and rehearsed. Please return your access badge and company property by end of day. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My mouth went dry. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to process what I'd just heard. Wait, there's been no discussion, no meeting, no chance to explain anything, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. I'm sorry, but the decision is final, came the cold response before the line went dead. I stood in that empty hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, staring at my phone's dark screen. 30 years. 3 decades of late nights, successful projects, mentored colleagues, crisis management. Gone in a 2-minute phone call. I walked back into the conference room where my team sat waiting, their faces turning from curiosity to concern as they read my expression. By the time I reached the building's main lobby, security was already waiting. My badge no longer worked at the turnstile. The little red light that had always turned green for 3 decades now just blinked its denial. I handed over my access card to the guard, a young man I'd greeted every morning for 5 years. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Have a good afternoon, Donovan, the receptionist said awkwardly, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to respond but nothing came out. Around me, colleagues I'd worked with for years suddenly found their phones fascinating or remembered urgent errands in opposite directions. I wasn't just being terminated. I was being erased. The walk across that lobby felt impossibly long, every step echoing in my ears. I thought about the merger I'd navigated, the restructuring I'd led, the countless problems I'd solved for this company. None of it mattered now. They'd removed me like I was nothing, without dignity, without explanation, without even basic professional courtesy. At home, I sat at my kitchen table in the stillness, trying to make sense of what had happened. My husband asked questions I couldn't answer. Why now? What did I do? Had there been warnings? I had nothing to tell him because I had nothing to understand. Then I remembered something. A document from years ago, stored in my home office from the merger 10 years back. I found the folder buried under tax returns and old performance reviews, dusty and forgotten. Inside were contracts, merger agreements, employment terms negotiated when the company was restructuring. I flipped through pages of legal language until I found it. Section 7, Subsection 3. A clause guaranteeing due process and mandatory board review before any senior executive termination. Not suggested. Not optional. Required. And there, at the bottom of the page, was CEO Blake Morrison's signature, dated and notarized. My hand started shaking, but not from fear this time. From something else entirely. They'd violated their own contract. Blake had signed my termination without following the process he'd legally agreed to. I spent that entire evening reading and rereading the contract, making sure I understood every word. The clause was clear, unambiguous, written in language even I could understand despite the legal terminology. Any termination of executives at my level required board notification, opportunity for response, and formal review. Blake had bypassed all of it. 30 years of loyalty, reduced to a phone call and a signature. The hurt was real, sharp, sitting heavy in my chest. But underneath the pain, something else was growing. Clarity. Purpose. I hadn't been terminated for cause. I'd been dismissed in violation of my contract. That changed everything. I opened my laptop and composed an email to Human Resources, keeping my tone professional and measured. I requested all documentation regarding my termination, including the CEO's authorization and any board communications. I cited the specific contract clause, attached a copy, and sent it before I could second-guess myself. No threats. No accusations. Just a formal request based on legal rights I apparently still had. The response came faster than I expected. Within 3 hours, my email was answered, not by the HR representative who'd called me, but by the director herself. Mrs. Donovan, we are reviewing your request and will respond within the required timeframe. Thank you for your patience. The message was brief, almost curt, but something about it felt different. The formal tone suggested they were being careful now, choosing words deliberately. They were unsettled. That night, I received another email, this one directly from CEO Blake Morrison. His tone was dismissive, almost irritated. Your termination was approved based on comprehensive performance evaluations and strategic restructuring needs. This decision is final and not subject to appeal. Please do not pursue this matter further as it will only delay your transition. I read it 3 times, my anger building with each pass. He had no idea what he'd just done. His response was evidence, documentation that he'd acted personally and unilaterally. He'd just confirmed in writing that he'd violated the contract. I forwarded the email to my personal account and made 2 backup copies. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Nathan Cross had handled my estate planning for years, but this was different territory. I explained the situation, sent him the contract and Blake's email. He called back an hour later. You have significant leverage here, Nathan said, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who'd found a winning hand. This isn't about hurt feelings or unfair treatment. This is breach of contract. The CEO signed an agreement requiring board review, then terminated you without it. That's legally actionable. We discussed strategy for an hour. Nathan advised patience, precision, and documentation. No public statements. No social media posts. No emotional outbursts. Just methodical legal pressure applied through proper channels. Let them make the mistakes, he said. You stay calm, stay factual, and let the contract do the talking. I agreed. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. This was about enforcing what they'd signed, about making them acknowledge they couldn't simply discard people who'd given decades of service without following their own rules. I spent the following days reviewing everything methodically. Every email I'd sent or received in the past year. Every project I'd led or contributed to. Every performance review I'd received, all of which had been positive or excellent. I created a timeline of my tenure, highlighting major accomplishments, successful initiatives, crisis management. I documented my last 6 months in detail, showing consistent performance and no warnings or corrective actions. Nathan had been clear about what we needed. We weren't just proving the contract violation. We were demonstrating that the termination itself lacked legitimate basis. I worked through this documentation with the same careful attention I'd always applied to my professional work. Each piece of evidence was organized, labeled, and stored securely. While Blake thought he'd disposed of a problem, I was building a case that would make his casual dismissal very expensive for the company. The anger was still there, burning quietly, but I channeled it into productive action rather than emotional reaction. Within a week, the board called an emergency meeting. Nathan attended virtually on my behalf, armed with the contract, Blake's emails, and documentation of the procedural violation. I wasn't invited to attend, but Nathan kept his phone on so I could hear the proceedings. Blake presented his reasoning with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Donovan's termination was a strategic decision based on performance metrics and organizational needs, he explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. The decision was made in the company's best interest and is not subject to reversal. Then Nathan spoke, his voice calm but firm. He cited the contract clause, displayed Blake's signature, and noted the complete absence of board notification or review. He submitted documentation showing no performance issues, no warnings, no corrective action plans. The CEO acted unilaterally in direct violation of contractual obligations, Nathan concluded. This isn't a disagreement about performance. This is breach of contract. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear papers shuffling, quiet conversations, the distinct sound of a board realizing they had a legal problem. 2 days after the board meeting, Blake requested a private call. Nathan advised me to keep him on the line as a witness, which I did. Blake's tone had changed dramatically from his dismissive email. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that sounded like concern, maybe even nervousness. "I want to clarify my position on your situation," he began carefully. "I was acting in what I believed were the company's best interests. I wasn't aware that the merger contract included those specific procedural requirements." I let the silence stretch, forcing him to continue. "The board has expressed concerns about how this was handled," he admitted. "I may have moved too quickly without proper consultation." "You bypassed the contract," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. "The board is now aware that you terminated me without following the legally required process. This isn't about speed or business judgment. This is about contractual obligations you chose to ignore." More silence. Finally, I underestimated the complexity of the situation. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. That was all I needed. I didn't gloat or threaten. I simply let his own words confirm what we already knew. The company's attorneys reached out the following week with a settlement offer. They proposed a severance package including 12 months of salary, continued benefits, and a neutral reference. In exchange, I would sign a release waiving all legal claims and agreeing to confidentiality. I reviewed the offer with Nathan over coffee at his office. The money was substantial, more than most termination packages. But the release was comprehensive, covering every possible claim including the breach of contract. "If you sign this, you give up your leverage," Nathan explained. "They're trying to make this go away quietly before the board asks harder questions about how Blake operates." I thought about it carefully. The money would help, especially with my retirement approaching. But signing meant accepting their version of events, validating their right to terminate me improperly. "I decline," I told Nathan. "Professionally and politely, but I decline. If they want to resolve this, they need to acknowledge what they did wrong, not by my silence." Nathan smiled slightly. "That's going to make them very uncomfortable. Which means they'll have to deal with the actual problem instead of just paying it away." Within days, something shifted in how former colleagues contacted me. Senior executives I'd worked with for years started sending private messages. Not through company email, but through personal channels, LinkedIn, even text messages. "What happened was wrong," one wrote. "You deserved better than that." Another said, "Blake's been making decisions without consultation lately. Yours wasn't the first." The board members themselves began quietly acknowledging my contributions. One reached out directly, asking about specific projects I'd led, decisions I'd made during the merger. It felt like due diligence they should have done before approving my termination. The company's general counsel requested a meeting to discuss my concerns. Not to present another offer, but to understand my position. For the first time, someone in authority was actually listening. My methodical, patient approach was creating space for truth to emerge. I wasn't screaming or threatening. I was simply standing on solid ground, letting them realize they'd made a significant mistake. The company's internal recognition of that mistake was growing, spreading through quiet conversations and careful reviews of what had actually happened. More evidence surfaced as people started looking carefully at the situation. Email threads showed Blake had personally directed my termination without board consultation. Calendar records proved no board meeting had discussed or approved the decision before it was executed. Performance reviews contradicted any claim of incompetence or inadequate work. The documentation was overwhelming. Every fact supported what I'd been saying from the beginning. This wasn't a performance issue. This was Blake acting impulsively, possibly protecting someone else or making space for a preferred candidate, and ignoring contractual protections in the process. Nathan compiled everything into a comprehensive memorandum for the board. Not threatening litigation, just laying out facts chronologically. Blake's signature on the contract. The clause requiring board review. The termination executed without that review. My consistent performance record. Blake's admission that he'd acted without proper process. The board couldn't ignore it. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about corporate governance, about whether executives could bypass legal agreements because they found them inconvenient. The implications extended far beyond my individual case. I found myself in a strange position of power. I didn't need the job back. After 30 years, I was ready to move forward, not return to a place that had dismissed me so carelessly. But I did need them to acknowledge what they'd done. I needed the record corrected. My reputation restored. The truth acknowledged publicly, even if quietly. That control felt important after weeks of feeling powerless. I'd been erased without explanation, treated like I was disposable after 3 decades of dedicated service. Now they needed something from me, a release, a settlement, an agreement not to pursue legal action, and I held the decision about whether to give it to them. I wasn't seeking revenge in any vindictive sense. I was seeking justice, accountability, and the acknowledgement that people couldn't simply be discarded when they'd followed all the rules, performed well, and earned the protections their contracts promised. The anger had transformed into something more productive. Determination. Clarity. A refusal to be erased quietly. Blake had assumed I would go away without resistance. He'd been wrong about that. Profoundly, expensively wrong. After reviewing all evidence and hearing from multiple parties, the board reached a formal conclusion. My termination had violated the merger contract. Blake had acted without authority, bypassing required procedures. The board acknowledged this in writing, not publicly but officially. They offered reinstatement to my former position with full back pay and benefits. It was a significant offer, a complete reversal of Blake's decision. But I had different plans now. Through Nathan, I negotiated a different resolution. Full compensation for the remainder of my expected tenure until retirement. Formal acknowledgement from the board that my termination had been procedurally improper. A neutral reference that acknowledged my 30 years of service and contributions. No confidentiality clause preventing me from discussing what had happened. No release waiving my right to speak about the breach of contract. They wanted this resolved, and I was willing to resolve it, but on terms that honored the truth rather than burying it. The negotiations took weeks, but eventually, we reached an agreement that felt right. I would leave the company, but I would leave vindicated, with my reputation intact and my rights acknowledged. Blake kept his position as CEO, but the board implemented new oversight procedures. His authority to make unilateral personnel decisions was curtailed. Major terminations now required board review before execution, not after. The company updated their policies to ensure contractual protections were followed. Blake's impulsive decision had cost him credibility and autonomy. He demonstrated poor judgment, and the board responded by limiting his discretion. I felt no satisfaction in his humiliation, if that's what it was. But I did appreciate that my stand had created systemic changes. The next person in my position would have protections that were actually enforced, not just written in contracts and forgotten. Blake had learned an expensive lesson about respecting legal agreements and following proper procedures. Whether he learned it well enough to change his management style remained to be seen, but at least the board was now watching more carefully. Sometimes consequences aren't about punishment. They're about accountability and ensuring the same mistakes aren't repeated with the next person. My final day at the company felt surreal. I wasn't cleaning out a desk or returning a badge. I'd already done that weeks ago. Instead, I signed the final settlement documents in Nathan's office, surrounded by the legal work that had transformed my termination into vindication. I received confirmation of payment, the board's formal acknowledgement, and documentation of everything we'd agreed to. Then I walked out, not with anger or bitterness, but with something closer to calm confidence. I'd been wronged, significantly and publicly. But I'd turned that wrong into accountability. I'd enforced protections that others had dismissed. I'd proven that contracts matter, that procedures exist for reasons, that people can't simply be erased when they've earned the right to due process. The chapter was closing, but I was closing it on my terms. Not as someone who'd been fired and disappeared quietly. As someone who'd stood up for themselves, used the tools available, and ensured that justice was served even when the CEO thought he could override it. Within a month, I accepted a senior advisory role at a competitor. The position offered flexibility, respected my experience, and paid substantially more than my previous role. I would work part-time, mentor younger executives, and provide strategic guidance without the daily operational burdens I'd carried for 30 years. It felt like the beginning I'd been working toward without knowing it. During my first week, the CEO of my new company asked about my availability. I told her the truth. I'd recently left my previous position after a contractual dispute that had been resolved in my favor. She nodded thoughtfully. We heard something about that through industry channels, she admitted. The word is you handled it with remarkable professionalism. That's exactly the kind of judgment we value here. My reputation hadn't been destroyed by Blake's termination. If anything, it had been enhanced by how I'd responded. I demonstrated patience, strategic thinking, and principled determination. Those qualities mattered more to people who understood leadership than any negative spin Blake might have attempted. 6 months later, I attended a regional industry conference. The event drew executives from dozens of companies, including my former employer. I saw Blake across the room during a networking reception. Our eyes met briefly. He looked away immediately, suddenly finding his phone extremely interesting. Throughout the evening, other executives sought me out. People asked about my new role, my insights on market trends, my thoughts on industry challenges. I was treated with the respect I'd earned over 3 decades, not as someone who'd been terminated in disgrace. Blake stood alone more often than not, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. The situation had resolved itself. He'd learned that dismissing people carelessly had consequences. I'd learned that standing up for your rights, even when it felt impossible, could lead to vindication. The conference reminded me that reputation isn't controlled by one person's decision. It's built over years through consistent work, integrity, and how you handle adversity. Blake had tried to erase mine. He'd failed completely. In quiet evenings at home, I reflected on everything that had happened. The initial shock of that phone call. The humiliation of the lobby walk. The discovery of the contract clause. The strategic decision to fight rather than accept. The methodical documentation and legal pressure. The board's eventual acknowledgement. My new position and restored reputation. It had been worth it. Every difficult moment, every strategic decision, every hour spent reviewing documents and building the case. Not because I'd destroyed Blake or hurt the company, but because I'd enforced accountability. I'd proven that contracts mean something. That procedures exist for important reasons. That people who've dedicated their careers deserve basic respect and due process. The experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I was more aware of contractual rights, more willing to stand up for myself, more confident in my judgment even when authority figures disagreed. I'd learned that staying calm and strategic was more powerful than emotional reactions. That documentation and facts matter more than accusations and anger. I found myself mentoring young professionals differently after my experience. When former colleagues reached out for advice, I emphasized the importance of understanding their contracts, knowing their rights, and documenting their work. I shared my story carefully, not as bitter complaint but as practical lesson. Assume the best from your employer, but protect yourself anyway, I told one young manager who was facing difficult dynamics with her supervisor. Keep copies of important documents. Know what your contract actually says. Build relationships with people beyond your immediate chain of command. You hope you'll never need those protections, but if you do, you'll be grateful you prepared. Several people told me my experience had influenced how they approached their own careers. They paid more attention to employment agreements. They documented their contributions more carefully. They understood that loyalty to a company didn't mean surrendering their rights or accepting mistreatment. My fight had become a resource for others, a case study in why preparation and principled resistance mattered. That felt meaningful in ways I hadn't anticipated when I was just trying to survive my own crisis. With the settlement finalized and my new role secured, I started planning for actual retirement in a few years. The financial security I'd fought for made that planning realistic and comfortable. I could afford to work part-time now, transitioning gradually rather than abruptly. I could choose projects that interested me rather than accepting everything out of obligation. I had control over my remaining career years in ways that might not have been possible if I'd simply accepted Blake's termination and walked away quietly. My wife and I talked about travel, about hobbies I'd postponed for decades, about grandchildren who deserved more of my time. The future felt open in ways it hadn't for years. Not because I'd won some dramatic victory, but because I'd stood up for myself when it mattered. Because I'd refused to be erased without acknowledgement. Because I'd enforced the protections I'd earned. That empowerment extended beyond just the settlement money. It was psychological, emotional, a restored sense of agency and worth that Blake's phone call had temporarily stolen but couldn't permanently take away. Looking back, I understood that Blake's arrogance had been his downfall. He'd assumed he could bypass the contract because he was the CEO, because I was close to retirement anyway, because fighting back would be too difficult or too expensive. He'd underestimated my willingness to stand up for myself. He'd ignored the legal protections he'd signed years earlier, probably never imagining they'd be enforced. His mistake was assuming power meant he could act without consequences. By staying calm, informed, and strategic, I'd proven that assumption wrong. I hadn't needed to yell or threaten. I hadn't needed public protests or social media campaigns. I just needed to know my rights, document the facts, and persistently insist that contracts meant something. The system worked, eventually, because I made it work. Because I refused to accept the easy narrative that CEOs could do whatever they wanted and employees had no recourse. Because I had help from a good lawyer and support from people who believed in fairness. Justice required work, patience, and strategy. But it was achievable. The victory wasn't dramatic or theatrical. There was no courtroom confrontation, no public apology, no viral social media moment. Just quiet acknowledgement that I'd been right and Blake had been wrong. Just systemic changes to prevent future violations. Just my reputation restored and my career continuing on better terms. That understated resolution felt more satisfying than any dramatic revenge could have been. I'd proven my point without destroying anyone. I'd enforced accountability without cruelty. I'd won on principle, not through power or vindictiveness. The company had corrected their mistake as much as institutions ever do. Blake had learned a lesson, though whether it changed him fundamentally I'd never know. And I'd moved forward stronger, wiser, and more confident in my ability to protect myself when necessary. Some people might have wanted more. Public humiliation for Blake. Major consequences for the company. Dramatic statements that made headlines. But I'd gotten what actually mattered. Truth acknowledged. Rights enforced. Dignity restored. Future secured. That was victory enough. 3 months after everything settled, I received an unexpected letter. Handwritten, on quality paper, marked personal and confidential. It was from the board chairperson. Your experience has reminded our entire leadership team why proper procedures and contractual obligations exist, she wrote. Your professionalism throughout this difficult situation reflected the standards we should always maintain. While we cannot undo what happened, please know that your contributions over 3 decades have been recognized and your handling of this matter has been exemplary. The letter wasn't required by our settlement. It wasn't legally necessary or even expected. It was simply acknowledgement from someone who understood what had happened and wanted to make sure I knew it mattered. I read it several times, feeling something release in my chest that I didn't know I'd been holding. This was closure. Not just financial or legal resolution, but human recognition. The board chair had taken time to acknowledge not just what Blake had done wrong, but what I'd done right. That validation meant more than I'd expected. Now, at 58, I wake up each morning to a life I control. I work when I want, on projects I choose, with people who respect my experience. I'm not broken by what Blake tried to do. I'm not bitter about the betrayal or angry about the fight I had to wage. I'm free. Free from a position that no longer served me. Free from a CEO who'd proven he didn't value my contributions. Free from the weight of wondering whether I should have stood up for myself. I did stand up. I did fight back. I did enforce the protections I'd earned. And I won. Not dramatically, but completely. Legally, morally, and professionally. The contract Blake signed all those years ago said I deserved due process before termination. When he ignored that clause, thinking it didn't matter or wouldn't be enforced, he learned otherwise. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. Sometimes it's simply making them honor what they signed. Making them acknowledge that contracts, and people, actually matter. That's what I did. And it changed everything.